Thank you very much, Norman, for a lecture that was profound and sentimental and bracing, and shows us better, perhaps, as King said, than many other subjects, how important the science and religion dialogue can be for so many areas of life. We have about 20 minutes for questions. There are 2 roaming mics. Please do raise your hand and speak into the mic.
Thank you so much. That's a lot or food for thought, sorry.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah, there. One of the things that I'm just thinking of now, you're talking about the ecology, you're talking about the development, the gift. What about the gift of death itself? What about the processes by which these animals are killed? I'm thinking like kosher, halal, other things. What implication does that have on the whole question?
Oh, yeah, right. It's a great question. There's multiple layers that we could bring into it, right? First of all, there is simply the meat industry today. And the way we not only raise the meat in these confinement operations, but also how we then process the meat. And these meat abattoirs, they are much like disassembly lines. I don't know if you know much about how this works, but like the logics of efficiency and profitability, when they get to work on the killing of animals, right? The idea is that you process them as quickly as possible. And that means that the animals are brought in through these chutes into these gates. They're strung up by chains on their legs, and they're lifted up, and they're supposed to have a bolt that's hit into their head, right? They don't use bullets anymore. It's just a bolt that hits the head, and it's supposed to render the animal mostly dead. Not completely dead, because insofar as the animal is mostly dead, the blood will circulate more quickly so that it will drain of the blood quicker. So this has all been done according to all sorts of studies to make sure that they have the maximum PSI, but not too much. Now, the reality, of course, is that this is not a science because animals are moving about. There's all sorts of frenzied activities. The people who are working them, right? Imagine your job is to basically kill animals all day. It's a pretty horrible atmosphere. It's an atmosphere that most people won't ever know about because the industry doesn't want you to know about it. So it's a system of utter brutality that doesn't honor the life of the animal at all. And this has to be contrasted, of course, with other cultures where the taking of the life of an animal was a matter of the utmost seriousness. And so ritual activity surrounded it. People who did the actual killing, right, they had to have all kinds of support networks, a kind of preparation to do the killing. Because how do you honor the life of this animal that you have spent your time taking care of? This is not a simple activity. And so in cultures where this is understood, everything is done to make sure the animal is in a condition where it is not feeling the terror of its own death. And so, people that I grew up with who killed chickens, right? The aim was to do it in a way as to make the animal as comfortable as possible before death. And that meant you don't kill in mass quantities. It means that if you're going to kill, you do it in such a way that the animal doesn't know it's coming. And so it's a radically different way. Now, to do slaughter in that way, you obviously can't slaughter in the volume that we do, in the speed that we do. But that's all right, because we should not have as many animals in confinement operations to begin with. Right? We eat a lot of meat. And I'm not opposed to eating meat. I eat meat myself. But what I would recommend is that we try to find the meat that we are going to eat that's been raised in a way that is humane for the animal and also slaughtered in a humane way. And there are many different ways that cultures have thought about it. But it's a great question. How we treat death. We've even degraded death in ways that would have been foreign to previous peoples.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting to listen to and very thought-provoking. I'm wondering how you shop.
How do I shop?
How do you shop?
Yes, so my favorite place to go is Weaver Street Market. And I'll be the first to say I'm not a perfect shopper. If you came and looked at my pantry, I would have some potato chips and Doritos. Do they have Doritos in Scotland? You do? Oh, they're really good. They've spent millions of dollars to get the crunch factor just right? There's an engineering lab in New Jersey that has worked on getting the right spice quotients for everything. I mean, this is all a science. So I do have that from time to time. So I'm not a perfect eater. And I have discovered that one of the most difficult things, I know I'm going to do badly when I don't have time. Okay, so to be a good shopper takes time, because you have to think about what you want to eat, where you want to source it. So, we have a very good friend, his name is Chaz Edens, and he raises pigs on his farm, raises them in a way that we admire, and he processes his pigs at a small-scale production facility, and he makes the most amazing pork, brats and things. So we buy from him, right? Weaver Street, we know some of the farmers who provide the food that comes into Weaver Street. So we love to go there because we don't just think that we're doing something good for our neighbors, our farmer neighbors, but it's also good for the community, right? It's become a gathering place for people because they just sense there's good stuff happening here. But does that mean I do all my shopping there? No. I'll go to the big grocery store where some of the stuff I buy, I'm sure that's probably not so good. So the idea is not to be, or not to hold up as your ideal that you be perfect. That's a lot to put on anybody, but to try to be better. Another thing to mention here, of course, is the issue of cost. Right? This is something that comes up all the time. And I fully grant that I am now in a position, because of the wage I make, that I can make some choices that I could not have made even 20 years ago. And so I want to also help people understand that there are different stages on life's way that people find themselves in. When you're a student, you can't make the choices that people who are not can make. So the point isn't to beat yourself up, but to try to be as knowledgeable about what you're doing with the aim of trying to do better. And then the idea would then to also try to figure out more creative solutions. So I don't know the context of agricultural economics in Scotland, but where I live in the United States, the Farm Bill is an enormous policy document that is directly related to the pricing of foods. So right now we have billions of dollars in subsidies going to the producers of corn. Most of that corn will never be eaten by a human being. It'll be made into ethanol for the fuel in your cars. It'll be made into the multiple kinds of plastics like diapers. It'll be made into the high fructose corn syrup, which is in all the processed foods. Very little of that, and a lot of it goes to feeding cattle and fish and chickens and every other creature we can imagine. We're genetically redesigning fish, by the way, so they'll eat more corn because we just grow so much corn we don't know what to do with it. So the Farm Bill is directly related to the pricing of our foods. So that if you grow real food like vegetables, like carrots or potatoes, under the USDA, that's a specialty crop. Gets no subsidies. So one of the reasons the cheap food is also the worst food to eat is because government is supporting terrible food in its policies. And as citizens, one of the things you want to do is you want to become knowledgeable about that. And I don't know what the situation is in Scotland. Where does government support for agriculture happen? How does it play out? If it's anything like America, it's not for the support of food production, it's for commodity production. And that needs to change, and that's a feature of what citizens ask for.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I was just wondering, you discussed different connotations of words, and I was just wondering, do you think the label of consumer affects our attitude of how we shop?
Yeah, I think so. I would ask people, how much do you think of yourself as a producer, as a maker of things? Right? How important is it for you to be a maker and not simply a shopper, a consumer of things? Now, consumer means a lot of things, and obviously I'm not going to say that I'm opposed to consuming. Right? We live by consuming. But when we think of ourselves as consumers, that's somewhat different. So if you've had the experience of, I'll give a relatively simple example. It's also a bit silly. I like to make my own salsa. It's the best salsa in the world. And I'm not joking. You could never afford to buy a jar of salsa from me because you'd have to pay, $200. It's that good. Now, you're hearing me say this, you think the guy's crazy, right? Because I can go into a store and I can buy a jar for $2.50. And you're going to charge $200? Now, what's happened here? Obviously, I'm being a bit ridiculous, but because I'm involved in the growing of tomatoes, or the growing of the peppers, or the onions, or whatever, and then I'm actually doing the work of making the salsa, right? Cooking down the tomatoes, peeling them, right? Adding the secret ingredients that nobody else knows about. It gives me a relationship to that salsa, which is just fundamentally different than if I had just purchased it at a store. It's sort of like when you make something, you invest yourself in it. And what you make is often the expression of your skill, your talent, but also your love. This is a huge, I'm glad you raised this question. It's so important. A book I highly recommend to you is by a friend of mine, Robin Kimmerer. She's a Native American woman botanist. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's a fabulous book. And in it, she tries to understand how, as an indigenous woman, she was trained by her elders to think about plants as her teachers. And then she went to graduate school to work with botanists who taught her that plants were stems or whatever. And she said this was a clash in her head, and she didn't know what to do with it. So she started to talk with elders, she started to talk with colleagues, and tried to understand something about the life of plants and the human place in a world in which plants are our teachers. And she says that she believes that human beings today who are living in advanced cultures, industrialized cultures, whatever, that people living in these cultures, they don't have the experience of giving their love to land and to creatures. And as a result, they don't know what it means to feel the land love them back. And so the world appears to them basically as a big store, as a production platform. And the analogy would be, what's it like for you to grow up in a home where you don't feel loved? What sorts of compensatory strategies do you have to come up with to think that your life actually matters? And what Robin says is that insofar as you give your life, your skill, your devotion, your care to the well-being of other creatures, and one of the basic ways that happens is through gardening, right? Growing some food. You begin to experience that your love is responded to by the love of the land coming to you. And she thinks there's a kind of mass psychosis that sets into a culture when people find themselves to be living in a world that really doesn't matter. Okay? The exercise that you sort of demonstrate every time you make things, and I'm guessing you've experienced this when you make a meal for people who come to your house. If they don't eat, what happens? Right? Imagine, you've cooked a big meal, you bring it to the people, you're sitting at the table, and they say, oh, I don't want to eat. What happens? My grandmother, she cried. Right? If I showed up and she had food for me and I didn't eat it, she'd say, eat. I say, I can't, Oma, I'm full. She said, no, eat. And if I didn't eat, she cried. So I ate. Why? Because her cooking the food was her saying, I love you. So by not eating, I was rejecting her love. So don't underestimate the power of investing yourself in the care of others, in the care of the world, because it's an exploration in what love could mean. Again, in a rather unsentimental way. We got way up top.
When I was young, which was in the early days of the Second World War, when I was young in the early days of the Second World War, there was a popular song, I think that went back to the 20s or 30s, saying, money is the root of all evil.
Money?
Money is the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. You've given a very interesting talk, so to speak, from the ground up, literally as well as metaphorically. It's the top-down problem, which seems to me inescapable. That is to say, large organizations, corporations that are in control of the whole economic structure, both of our food, of which you've spoken very eloquently, but also of the whole economic system. Now, people like Monsanto, for example, a few years ago wanted to buy up a patent for all agricultural and other seeds. Now, from my recollection, fortunately, they didn't get away with it.
No, they have patented seeds.
Sorry?
They have patented seeds.
And they patented seed also so that it controlled genetic
Right.
crops.
Yes.
Ah, I thought they'd not
No,
got away with it.
that is now well underway.
Yes. Now, there's a great argument about genetic crop production.
Right.
But when large organizations, corporations, have such control, the individual at the other end feels very impotent to me.
Right.
I feel very impotent as somebody who's very much into recycling,
Right.
reads what are the contents of the food that has been produced as a commodity in our supermarkets. And I'm speaking about the UK as a whole. And things like rapeseed oil, but more particularly palm oil, for example, which is now in all our foods together with many other things.
Right, right.
And one tries to eat food which in fact is as natural as possible. And we do have a garden in which we don't use pesticides at all and so on. But again, one feels impotent because this bears no relation to the way that food is produced and is so easily accessible in Western countries, America, Europe. But when you go to other poor countries like Africa and Indonesia, I mean, immensely rich in some area, but there are always people who are more interested in the power that money gives them to buy. And this is where you're getting to a culture where from the ground up, we are still having mass starvations in certain areas of the globe, even now, in South America and so on, Africa in particular. I see no way out of this because I think we are the most pernicious and destructive animal that the planet has ever produced. And we're now a victim of our own desire for money and power and the exploitation of others.
Right. Yeah, so there's an enormous amount in what you're saying. And so you're absolutely right to talk about the centralization, consolidation of almost all food sectors, right? Seed, poultry, beef, all of the basic food elements are now controlled by a very small number of corporations. And it's very clear that their aim all along has been to be the controllers of the food system, because people can maybe live without oil, but they can't live without food. There's also been an effort to privatize the fresh water of the world, and that's happening all over. Land is being grabbed by major corporations and foreign governments all around the world because a lot of places are becoming soil poor. So the best way to handle soil poverty is to buy somebody else's soil, displace the peasants, indigenous peoples that are there. I mean, the litany of things is truly awful, and I could go on with you and we could drink over it for a good long time. I don't believe that we're doomed, however, because what's been remarkable to see is that there are exhibitions of this happening in varying parts of the world where people are simply either opting out or going around these highly centralized, consolidated operations, and are doing the kinds of protest action which are actually creating a second, much smaller in scale to be sure, but a second food economy, which is highly localized, highly diversified, that emphasizes heirloom varieties, that refuses seed patenting or the patenting of any life form. Now, what's going to happen long term? I have really no idea how it's all going to play out. I don't think anybody does. But the question is whether or not we're going to be able to mobilize people to understand what's at stake. And the things that you mentioned are clearly at stake. Whether or not people are going to have food sovereignty. Will there be food democracy? Right? These are major questions. And to see that there are in varying parts of the world, this is not simply an elite culture kind of phenomenon. All around the world, we're seeing examples of people who are refusing to accept the terms. And the question is whether or not citizens like you and I, who are not in agricultural work, perhaps, or food production, whether or not we'll come alongside and support them. Which is why I think it's so important for people to become educated about the food systems in which they move. Because insofar as we begin to understand some of these issues, we can make decisions that will make a difference. Whether it will save the planet, I mean, that's way beyond my comprehension. I think there's a tremendous amount of presumption in claiming to know the outcome. And so the better thing is to simply figure out what you love and figure out how to put your love to good work. That's the short answer to a much more expansive kind of question that you raised. There was also another one.
Thank you so much for...
All right, fine. One more.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I can second Braiding Sweetgrass. It's an amazing book. But my question for you is, because we are likely, most of us, not going to go grow a bunch of food tonight.
Even a little bit?
I wish I could.
Okay.
Wish I had a bigger space.
All you need is a pot.
You do need a pot.
And a window.
I am wondering, you mentioned voting with your fork, and all of us will go purchase food, many of us will go purchase food. Can you speak a little bit more about the impact of voting with your fork and what that can do?
So I'll just use the region that I'm living in right now as an example of this. If you had come to Durham, North Carolina 30 years ago, it was what we would call a food swamp. It was a place where the food was not very good. It was all fried chicken. And so you were not going to live very long. Barbecued and fried chicken was all that there was. There was almost no small-scale agriculture devoted to the production of real food, vegetables, right, animals treated in a humane fashion, fruits. That just didn't exist. But about 30 years ago, a number of people, small number of people it started out with. One of them is my friend Charlie Thompson, who's at Duke now in Doc Studies. But he was one of the early farmers who had decided about 10 years before that he was going to go organic. Right, he had grown up in agricultural communities and understood something about the heavy toll that pesticide, herbicide application was having on land and water. And he said, I just need to do it differently. So together with some other farmers who had also decided to go organic, this was before organic was a thing. There was no label USDA organic yet. They decided to farm differently, and they decided, how are we going to make this available to people who want to buy our stuff? Right? There was no social media at this stage, right? They decided to host a farmer's market in Carborough, a small neighboring town to Durham. And this farmer's market exploded. And a whole number of other farmers started to see the success of Charlie and some other people like Alex and Betsy Hitt and some others. And in 30 years, we've become a hotbed for small-scale agriculture. Almost every restaurant is farm-to-table restaurant. If you don't source your restaurant with locally grown food, people will say, what's wrong with you? Right? So in the space of 30 years, there's been this transformation so that rather than being a place where people thought, there's nothing happening here, now Durham and Raleigh and Chapel Hill and places like this where I live, they're regularly written up in the New York Times food pages because they're leading the way. It started with a few people, right? And I think this is something that we shouldn't ever lose sight of, is the power of some committed people to make possible a different imaginary. I think what's troubling about the food system that we're in and the people who are the boosters of today's food system is that they have no imagination for a different way to think about food. So that as we're witnessing that the Green Revolution techniques that exploded yields, people are looking at a 10 to 11 billion population 40 years down the road and are saying we have to double yields again. That means 500 bushels per acre of corn? Seriously? There's just no imagination for doing it differently. And so the thing to do is to resist that smallness of imagination. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Norman again for making us think, hopefully making us act.